This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
I am happy to introduce Ryan Sullivan, who will shortly be introducing himself yet again to discuss his topic today, which is Celtic coinage. And this is something that Ryan is something of a specialist in. So with that, Ryan, I will let you introduce yourself and your topic now.
Oh, well, thank you, Peter. Well, it was going to just be a very informal introduction, as I imagine the vast majority of you have seen my face, heard my name come up once or twice. But I've been working at the ANS for almost the past 3 years, and I'm currently serving as Publications Production Manager and Membership Coordinator. A lot of my background, though, more so, is on Celtic, Iron Age, Britain, and on the continent. And I had done a long table back in, I think it was February, really just focusing on that material. And since then, I've just been trying to think of, I don't know, just different inroads and different things. Like Irish mythology has always been just one of my, just something that's just always really intrigued me, a way to try to understand past behaviors, past religions, beliefs. And I started wondering, well, like, with all of this mythology and the importance of it, I wonder if Ireland had turned to it with its own kind of numismatic history after independence from England. And so I started looking through, and this isn't intended to be any kind of like an in-depth catalog of everything, really just kind of more an exploration of some of the things that I found, a discussion of some of the stories that go into the beings and people that are being represented, and maybe how these stories could help us understand what the Irish Republic was trying to communicate, or the different organizations that might have been issuing these medals. I've got a collection of, we're going to look at coins, there's medals, military decorations, banknotes. So it's a pretty good selection of things, but about 12 objects in total is what I was able to find. So let's go ahead and start my screen. Okay. Okay, so a good place to start is just a very, very broad overview, I think, of Irish history, just in case people aren't necessarily particularly familiar with it. And I'm starting back all the way back around 3200 BCE, not necessarily to take the long history view, but just because at this point in time, it was the Neolithic in Ireland. We were starting to see the construction of these really incredible tombs and burial mounds and all sorts of like hedges, just really interesting earthworks. And as time goes on and people have been living with these different sites, they started to apply stories to them. And so something like, you might have heard of the Brug na Boyne or Newgrange, maybe the Hill of Tara, these started having stories layered onto them, and they were viewed as, maybe houses of the gods. If you walked into them, you could be transported to another world. And so then fast forward all the way to the arrival of Christianity. And the reason I call that out is because, one, like, it is important because it starts changing just the way that people religious beliefs and things, but more importantly, because there starts to be a switch from an oral tradition over to more literature. And so the scribes and the monks, as they're sitting there, they're actually starting to record these myths that allow us to come down to us today. The Lavor na Hydra, which we'll talk about later, was written in, it's the oldest extant Irish manuscript, I believe. It was written around 1100 CE. And from there, we start seeing there's a Strongbow invasion of the Normans in 1169, the plantation period from about the 1550s to 1620s, and although that does continue a bit longer, the Flight of the Earls, the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the Fenian Uprising, and all of these are important in their own right. But what I'm just wanting to call out in this is that through Ireland's history, starting all the way back with 1169 in some degree, came under greater and greater English domination. They started chasing out all the older kind of the Gaelic social structures and earls, and in some senses, dispossessing, excuse me, the Irish inhabitants of their land, taking it for the crown, and pushing them elsewhere. Fast forward now to the 19th century. This is, of course, all throughout Europe, we hear a lot about nationalism. People are really fixating on kind of their roots in a way, and Ireland is no different. So you have what's called either the Gaelic Revival, sometimes known as the Celtic Literary Revival, that springs about in this time period because suddenly we're able to decipher Old Irish again. And so we're starting to be able to unlock these texts. And with all of these old Irish myths, something that would able to set Ireland apart with its own kind of like cultural heritage and traditions starts getting built into more contemporary works of literature and art. People start turning to characters like the Cuchulainn and Maeve and the Dagda, Morgan, and painting them, writing plays about them based off of the myths, but offering their own kind of interpretations. Then in 1916, you have the Easter Rising, which we'll discuss a little bit more later on, the Irish War of Independence, the Irish Civil War, and then the Irish Free State, and then the Republic of Ireland beginning to issue its own first coins and banknotes. Having come off of a civil war and everything, they were really keen not to have kind of political tropes on their currency, but as we'll see, that's maybe not necessarily always the case, looking at it from this mythological kind of standpoint. So just a quick introduction on Irish myth. The image on the left is a burial tomb of Newgrange, one of those where it was believed to be inhabited by the Dagda, sometimes Angus. But important things to know about Irish myth is that they were originally rooted in oral traditions, but as I had said, they were recorded by Christian monks. And even though these Christian monks were writing them down, they weren't just kind of, doing it word for word. It was an active, lived tradition. And so they were adopting them to this new society, this new kind of Christianizing society. And you get these really weird, interesting combinations of maybe pagan gods, maybe, alongside saints, communicating with one another, and kind of in friendly terms. It's really an interesting combination of things. And there's different genres that you have. There's what's called Talkmark, which are almost kind of wooing tales. There's Ectra or adventure tales, Imram, which are voyage tales. And we'll talk about some of these later on, but they would be told in very specific kind of situations potentially. So the wooing tales may be leading up to a wedding, talking about how a hero went and found and won one of his brides. And then myth is broken into 4 different cycles. There's the mythological cycle, and this has a lot more kind of like what we might traditionally think of as mythological kind of content. Ideas of the peopling of the world, or how this came to be made, why this is the way that it is. The Ulster cycle is probably one of the more extensive. There's hundreds of different tales in it, and it really centers in the court of Ulster in northeastern Ireland, with Conchobar MacNessa. We have Cuchulainn, who we'll hear more so, and these are really heroic tales, but they have to do with court society. The Fenian cycle, on the other hand, follows the hero Finn McCool and his band of people, the Fianna, And they all have sorts of interesting different abilities. Sometimes they can talk to animals. Some of them are able to shapeshift into different animals. But instead of being really focused more kind of like in the courts, they're out in the wilds of Ireland on their adventures, and also Britain and further afield. And then the cycle of kings are these quasi-mythologized histories of important founding members of different dynasties. And before we go too far into it, I just want to call out, not all mythical motifs are natively Irish. And part of this is just because I thought that these images were really beautiful. These are all taken from the reverse side of the banknotes, Series A banknotes, I believe, though I think the Series A banknotes that were released early on. And each of these images represents a different river, and it's based off of a sculpture at the Customs House in Dublin. But interestingly, they're all men. But if you go and you look at actual Irish literature, there are lots of river deities, but they tend to be women, particularly the 20 and the 50-pound notes, which are the kind of the red and the purplish ones. Those are the River Boyne and the River Shannon, there was the goddess Bowen, who has her own very long mythology. Shannon has a lot of overlapping mythology with Bowen, but she is her own kind of figure. But they were not kind of like brought up in this manner. So all those aside, now getting into our first banknotes. So in 1928, the Irish Free State released a series of banknotes depicting an emblematic female figure. This isn't a particularly novel idea. If you look at a lot of currency around the world, you look at a lot of myths, there are kind of notions of territories as women. But this has a very particular kind of salience in Ireland, where goddess figures were frequently associated with natural figures like rivers and mountains. So in the image in the top right there are a couple of mountains, County Kerry, called the Paps of Anu, which are believed to be the breasts of the goddess Anu or Danu, who was kind of like the mother of the Celtic pagan deities in a way. They're also sometimes known as like the Paps of the Morrigan, who is another mythical queen and goddess. And then the River Boyne in the bottom right, as I was saying, is strongly associated with the goddess Bowen, who she goes and she travels to this well trying to get knowledge, and the waters like erupt from it, and she ends up losing an eye, and she ends up losing an arm and a leg, and these things are kind of like washed away into the river, but she becomes one with the river. So instead of just kind of like representing it, she is the river. The idea of the land goddess, though, it wasn't just purely this idea of like the earth and the goddess. There were also notions of kind of territoriality and sovereignty and rightful rulership. In early Ireland, subscribed to a type of sacral kingship. And when a king was being inaugurated, there would be, of course, is almost kind of like a marriage ceremony between the king and the land. It could be the ritual consumption of horse meat. A lot of Irish goddesses were associated with horses. More often, it would have to do with ingesting mead and drinking that. But essentially, the sovereign and the land were intricately intertwined. If the king were good and virtuous, if they were generous, if they were brave, if they exhibited just all of the characteristics that you would want in a ruler, then the land would prosper and be fruitful. If the sovereign were not, on the other hand, then the land would wither. And the goddess herself then was like a reflection of these properties. There are all sorts of sovereignty myths a lot of them being in that cycle of kings that I had mentioned earlier. Whereas the future king, the hero, the founder of a dynasty, is out in the wild somewhere and comes across this crazed woman, or this old hag is unfortunately the way it's always translated, crone. She's not in her state of mind. And so just as an example of one of these, the story of Neil and the Well. And Neil, of 9 hostages, he lived probably around 400s AD, but he went on to found the O'Neill dynasty that was really influential for centuries, particularly up in Ulster. And in this story, he and his 4 brothers are traveling through the woods. They make camp for the night, and one of the brothers goes out to go collect some water. And as he approaches, there is this ugly old woman standing there. She wants him to kiss her. There's other things that she maybe has in mind, but he's not that interested in the water, and so he goes back. He tells his brothers. They think he's ridiculous. Another one goes, same situation, comes back. Third brother, I believe it was, goes. Again, he's repulsed by this woman. And then one of Neil's half-brothers goes, and he meets the woman, and he's willing to give her a kiss because he wants the water. But he gives the kiss, takes a drink, heads back to the camp, but it's Neil who comes, and he's able to see beyond this woman and who she is, and potentially who she is in reality. And so not only does he kiss her, but he lays with her. And within that union, she becomes her young, beautiful self. And it's a representation of how Neil was the rightful ruler. And because he had coupled with this woman, she was able to be young and fruitful. And while all of this is, very interesting, I hope. I guess I should pause for a moment and call out, the actual banknote here. You can see it shows this beautiful figure of a young woman leaning up against a harp. There's a lake off in the distance and the mountains. And this is actually based on a portrait. It was adopted a portrait by John Lavery, and it was originally called Lady Lavery as Kathleen Houlihan. And Kathleen Houlihan is a 1-act play that was written by William Butler Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory, and those are names that you're going to hear time and again. They're really big in the Celtic literary revival. Yeats was really involved with the numismatics of the new Irish state as well. But in this play, it's this young man's wedding day. His family is sitting there in their house, and they can hear all these cheers down by the water. And this old woman starts making her way up to their house, and she comes in. She sits by their fire. There's lots of conversations, but essentially there's all these cheers and shouts again, just off in the distance. She goes on about how her lands had been stolen from her, the provinces of Ulster. And that they could only be replenished by really the blood of the true patriots. And the groom-to-be, as he's sitting there, he feels inspired. He runs off. It turns out that I believe it might be the landing of the French, maybe it was, but the beginnings of potentially some kind of rebellion. He goes off to join it, and this old woman, Kathleen Houlihan, wanders off down the road, but she actually transfigures into this regal, queenly young woman. And just thinking, so with that in mind, and just thinking about how Yeats' involvement and just the importance of this play, Kathleen Houlihan, Yeats at least looked back later wondering, how much this inspired nationalism and eventually kind of the Easter Rising and the Civil War and the independence, just what role did that play in all of the lives that were ultimately lost? And so we could potentially conceive of this image of this young, beautiful woman on the new banknotes as arguing for the restoration of correct sovereignty. It's no longer that the English have control, but the Irish are in control, and now the island will be able to prosper under their reign. So another component of this, and I will say, maybe this could be taking it a little bit far, but it's just kind of this notion of the name between Hibernia and Era, or Erin, Ireland. Hibernia being the much more kind of Latinized, classicized, almost kind of like an imperial sort of name, as opposed to the Irish era. And this ties back to one of the most important texts in Irish myth, which is the Lavor Gabhala Erin, or the Book of the Taking of Ireland. And this essentially goes through, it's a really weird, fascinating work where the Irish essentially kind of try to tie themselves into the history of the Old Testament and classical and Homeric epic. It's really kind of fascinating. But just to fast forward in a way, the Tuatha De Danann, who are the pre-Christian deities, had control of Ireland. And the Milesians, who eventually become the Gaels or the Irish, travel across by boat. They attempt to make landfall. But the Tuatha, they know that if they land, that they're going to lose control over their territories. And so they try to fight. There's some battles. There's a lot of magic and singing and fog and things happening. And one of these characters is actually Era, the goddess who Ireland is named after. And so the Milesians, they travel through to her home, which is in Ishneck, which is at the very center of Ireland. It's kind of the Omphalos in a way. It's considered, the center of their reality. And as they approach there, and she realizes that the time of the Tuatha De Danann had kind of passed, she says, "Warriors, long-kept soothsayers had knowledge of your coming. Yours shall be this island forever, and to the east of the world there should not be a better island. No race shall there be more numerous. A gift to me that my name shall be on this island." And the chief poet, Amargin, says, "Yours shall be its principal name." There are a couple other names because she has two sisters. I believe it's like Fonla and Banva. I think I'm butchering those. But hers is the principal name. And so we could potentially draw a connection then between this notion of, between Hibernia to Erin. And the connection being that you see on the left-hand side, there is this sculpture called Hibernia with the bust of Lord Cloncurry. But the watermark of the dollar bill was inspired and taken from this statue. But in the documentation, they don't really refer to her as Hibernia. They refer to her as Erin. So potentially, and maybe it's a stretch, could make this argument that this reappropriation of the Irish name is also reaffirming kind of this Irish tendency on the island, the right to the island, and it being kind of their homeland for the future going forward. Another figure that we'll talk about is Cuchulainn, and he is kind of the principal hero of Irish mythology, largely, if not exclusively, in the Ulster cycle, but there are so many tales about him, and we'll talk about his life a little more. But just to start, I want to say, and we'll talk about him as a character more, but I wanted to talk about this medal, which was issued in 1964. It's the Distinguished Service Medal for the Irish Defence Forces. And in their own description, they say it depicts the hero Cuchulainn with upraised sword, standing in a war chariot drawn by 2 horses at a gallop. A charioteer crouched beside him whips the horses. And you can tell that, it's really Cuchulainn is the important character here, but I just want to say that, these horses and the charioteer, they're not invisible in the mythological record. There's in fact several stories about them. Leg is the charioteer. He's known as the king of charioteers, almost always accompanied by Cuchulainn, but occasionally has to go on journeys of his own. Cuchulainn is wasting away, and so he travels into the other world to try to find this fairy woman that has been calling to him and beckoning to him and causing Cuchulainn to just waste away in longing. The horses, the Liv Macha and the Duv Singlen, also known as like the Grey of Macha or the Black of Singlen, they actually were gifted to Cuchulainn by, depending on the story, there's different goddesses, either Macha or the Marigan, who are very much tied to war and the protection of Ulster. But I did like that this medal is awarded to officers, non-commissioned officers, and privates of the Irish Defence Forces, as well as members of the Army Nursing and Chaplaincy Services. And that's really the case for most of the medals I saw for the Irish Defence Forces, but I thought it kind of encapsulates this notion of it's not just the warrior in the war effort. There's also kind of like the full kind of quote-unquote war machine. So talking about Cuchulainn, and I'm not going to go into too much depth on these parts just because I've been taking my sweet time talking through things. But he is a demigod born from a quasi-incestuous triple birth. It's very strange. He gets adopted as a baby. He dies. The woman that adopted him gets impregnated by the god that fathered the first baby, but then everyone thinks that she had an incestuous relationship with her brother, and so then she aborts the baby, and then she's considered a virgin again. She gets pregnant from this new man, and voila, all of these people happen to be Cuchulainn, and he is finally born. And while this one is particularly strange, those kind of births aren't that uncommon in Irish myth. It's a good way to set someone aside as having an interesting future. He was born as, I think it's pronounced Shetanta, before earning the title Cuchulainn, only at the age of 5. In that, just imagine, his uncle had gone to attend a feast, and, Cuchulainn, he wasn't done playing with all of his friends, and so, he was told, oh yeah, go ahead, you can just catch up later. We'll make sure there's food for you, all of those different kinds of things. But when they get there, they totally forget that Cuchulainn was going to come around. And they release this giant dog. It's supposed to be the size of a pony, absolutely vicious. And suddenly, as they're eating their dinner joyfully, they hear all this crazy barking. And then suddenly they remember that Cuchulainn, or Shetanta, was on his way. And they run to the ramparts to just watch him get torn apart. But really, he's playing with his hurley ball. He sees this dog charging him. He just hurls it down the dog's throat. It goes down into his gullet. He grabs the dog, whips him against a rock a couple of times, and even though he's this itty-bitty tyke, is able to easily kill this dog. Cullen, who is the host and the smith deity, is just like, oh, I wish I had never thrown this party, because now I no longer have anyone to guard my fields. And Shetanta says, well, I can be your dog for the next year while we're training a replacement. And that's how he earned the name Cuchulainn, or the Hound of Cullen. At the age of 7, he chooses his destiny. He's walking around and he overhears the chief druid telling his classes that today is an auspicious day. If someone were to take up arms, they would be destined to have their name live forever in glory, but they would live a short life. And I don't think Cuchulainn had heard the second part about, he would live a short life if he had taken up arms, just the kind of eternal fame and glory, which is really what every Irish soldier wanted at that time period. And so he runs off to his uncle, asks for some spears, some weapons, and they give him all these different weapons, but he keeps breaking them one after the other. None are really good enough for him until the king Conchobar himself gives him his own weapons to try out. And those, of course, are equal to the status of this hero. And because he had then taken up arms, he then has this incredible destiny ahead of him. He's really kind of the principal hero of Ulster. He's brave, eloquent, charming. He's really nice to look at. The descriptions are weird, though. He has 7 fingers on each hand and I think 7 pupils in each eye and 4 dimples on each of his cheeks. It's strange, interesting, but he's essentially considered kind of the ideal courtier. He's feared for his unrivaled skill in battle, but more than that, he has this terrifying ability known as the Rheostrad, and it's translated various ways, but kind of the best one is known as the warp spasm. And it's this berserker battle fury where his bones turn around in his body and his eye on one side starts to swell until it's like projecting from his skull, and the other eye gets sucked back so far into a skull like a crane couldn't even pull it out. Blood is spurting out in this crazy halo. And so he could just go on a tear and just kill countless people within this. He's best known, however, for his defense of Ulster during the great Irish epic, the Toinba Cooley. And this is an epic, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we're going on. As I said, it's the principal one, but in it, the forces of Ireland, plus a contingent of some Ulstermen, essentially invade Ulster in hopes of acquiring the prized brown bull of Cooley. The Ulstermen, for the vast majority of them, they are struck by a curse and they cannot get out of bed. Years before, the goddess Macha had cursed them and told them that at the hour of their greatest need, they would suffer from the pangs of childbirth. And so Cuchulainn, who, because he came outside of Ulster, isn't afflicted by this, and it's left to him to single-handedly protect the entire province against this huge invading army. Of course, he can't protect it all, but there's all sorts of incredible exploits where he, fights off so many different soldiers and different warriors. Probably, I think, the most tragic battle of the story, though, and one that I think carries a lot of symbolism that we'll talk about in a couple of the slides going forward, is his battle against his foster brother, Ferdiad. Ferdiad, at first, he did not want to fight Cuchulainn, and it's not because he was scared of Cuchulainn, he thought he would lose or anything like that. It's because they legitimately loved one another. They were raised with one another, they were trained as warriors together, they went on excursions together, but Maeve ultimately says, well, I guess it's exactly true what Cuchulainn had said. You are absolutely too cowardly to fight him. So, of course, this is the ultimate gauntlet throwdown in Ireland. And so he goes and he fights Cuchulainn, and it takes place over several days. And at first, it's kind of like a friendly competition. They're fighting with this type of sword, that type of javelin, this type of spear. Things start out nice. They share a fire, they share medical supplies, but as the days wear on, they realize that one of them is going to die. And ultimately, it does happen. Cuchulainn unleashes one of his ultimate weapons, which is known as the Gay Bolga, is this weird kind of spear that he throws with his foot. And when it goes in, it kind of has barbs that erupt. And it ends up killing Ferdiad, and Cuchulainn carries him out of the ford where they had been having their battle. It's very tragic, and it's something you could see really resonating with a society that had just come out of civil war, where there were so many people who had died, and on different sides, and families finding themselves on different sides. And so given all of these positive qualities, many exploits of his life, it's really no wonder that it'd be chosen for some sort of medallic representation, but it's really in his death that it really acquires so much of this symbolism. So Irish myth has these interesting things called geisha, and they're taboos that are specific to you that you should never break. And you know that a hero is about to die because some sort of crazy situation happens where they have to break one or other taboo, and it starts leading to their demise. So Cuchulainn, recognizing the signs for what they are, though, he doesn't turn back. He continues forward. And while he's there, like this is after the end of the Táin. Most of the forces of the rest of Ireland have returned home, but name of one of his enemies who is escaping me and I did not write down, and a contingent of some sorcerers essentially set out to ambush Cuchulainn, and they first, they have 3 spears, and they throw a spear, and first it impales Leg, his charioteer, and Leg falls to the ground, and it's up to Cuchulainn to continue on with the chariot. But another spear is thrown and goes through one of the horses, and so of course the chariot can't continue, and the horses, they run off back to where they had returned into the other world in the lake from where they had first emerged. And then ultimately, the third spear lands its mark and goes through Cuchulainn's innards. And so as he's sitting there on the ground, his intestines kind of spilled out before him. I'm sorry, this is all very grisly. He goes, he gets a drink, and even then, his enemies refuse to approach him. They're so scared of what he might be able to do, even literally on death's doorstep, that they will not approach him. But he ends up moving over to a pillar stone, tying himself upright to it with one of his belts, and eventually he dies. And the only way that they realize he dies is because the Morrigan, in the shape of a crow, comes and lands on his shoulder. So the images that you're seeing before you, the Death of Cuchulainn is the name of the sculpture on the left, and it was actually created, I believe, in either 1911 or 1914, prior to the 1916 Rising. But it ends, even though it wasn't really kind of created with this idea of a national sacrifice in mind, Oliver Shepherd had really seen Cuchulainn more as kind of a cognate figure with Christ and sacrificing himself in those regards. The president, Taoiseach, I think is how it's pronounced, Eamon de Valera, is looking for some kind of symbol, though, to commemorate the 1916 Easter Rising, and he lands on this sculpture, and it ends up being adopted for the 1916 medal, or the 1916 Survivors Medal. The 1916 medal was issued, I think, sometime in the, I guess in 1941, and it was for people who had taken part in the Easter Rising, and then again on the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. But the Easter Rising is really incredibly important event, maybe somewhat akin to the shot heard around the world in some regards, though I think much more emotionally charged. In that, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, I believe it was, had been planning an uprising, and originally it was going to be for Easter. And they were waiting on a shipment of arms from Germany, which unfortunately never ended up making their way to them. Some of them, they tried calling off the uprising. Some people did not show up for it, some did. And essentially they end up signing and proclaiming the existence of the Irish Republic. And of course, the opposing forces are not too pleased about this, and there ends up being a battle of, I think it's across 6 days, where they're holed up around the General Post Office. There are a lot of lives lost, including 14 of the leaders of the rebellion are taken prisoner, they're court-martialed, and then they're eventually executed by a firing squad. And de Valera saw, just as Cuchulainn had died, in a sense, in service to Ulster and protecting Ulster, he saw a similarity between all of these people who had died during the uprising, during the rising. And so essentially he elevates all of these individuals to the same status as Cuchulainn. This takes its strongest kind of form, though, in 1966, the 50th anniversary, they release a new 10 shilling coin in silver, and it has the death of Cuchulainn on the reverse, and on the obverse is a portrait of Patrick Pearse. And Patrick Pearse was one of the ringleaders of the Rising. He actually had read out the proclamation. He was one of the signatories. He was named the president of the Republic at that point. But nobody wanted, the wounds were just too fresh in the 1920s. But 50 years later, this is the first time that an Irish coin, post-independence, included the image of an actual person. It had previously, there had just been animals, emblematic women, but this is the first time that you see an actual human, actual character and personality. And I think it serves to really then elevate Patrick Pearse to this kind of culture hero level, just as Cuchulainn does, in a way that's even more kind of strongly aligned than we'd see with the medals. Okay. All right. Then in 1976, the Central Bank of Ireland issued a new series of banknotes honoring the island's arts and literature. The new pound note featured the portrait of Queen Maeve on the front. We'll talk about her in a bit. But then a sampling of the Lavor na Hydra on the reverse. And this is an actual image taken from one of the pages of that text. It's unfortunately not like the Book of Kells or one of those other really incredible illuminated manuscripts. So I didn't bring in more pictures of it, but it's really important to know that one, the Lavor na Hydra is the oldest extant manuscript in Irish, and it's housed at the Royal Irish Academy. And then for the sake of mythology, it contains fragments of so many really incredible, important works to Irish myth, including the Toyn, a few different Tuckmark tales, and all sorts of other ones. And so this is a nod to that mythology and cultural history. The book was originally written at the monastery of Clonmacnoise, which is the image you can see here next to the River Shannon. All right. Maeve, the front of the pound note, as I said, it features the Queen Maeve, and so often she's portrayed in this negative light as she's being deceitful, untrustworthy, overly promiscuous, all these kinds of very negative, judgmental things, especially probably as the male Christian monks are really setting these tales down in writing. But I really think it's just a matter of perspective, and you could see her as just being, very ambitious and not willing to let anything get in her way. Mev was the queen of the kingdom of Connaught, which is on the western side of Ireland. So you can see in orange was Ulster, and this does change. These are 5 provinces, then it ends up going to like 4 provinces of medieval Ulster, but just getting a sense for kind of where she was located. And she was queen of the kingdom in her own right, either having inherited from her mother, depending on the story, having it gifted to her by her father, or taking it after she toppled and killed her older sister. She's described, or she at least describes herself as being, generous in bestowing gifts and favors, powerful in warfare, fight and fray, and never having one man without another standing in his shadow. All she ever asked in return was a man without jealousy, meanness, or fear. And that kind of comment then is what starts leading to the outbreak of the Táin and this invasion of Ulster to get this bull. And while she's laying in bed one night with her husband, he makes the not so smart comment of well-off woman, wealthy man's wife. And she says, yes, of course, but don't forget that I am wealthy. Without you, I was wealthy before you, I'll be wealthy after you. And so, of course, they have to put it to the test, and so they call on their servants to bring out all of their stores of wealth. And I'm going to read it just because it's interesting, maybe from a, maybe not numismatic, economic kind of cultural perspective, and how they measured their wealth in medieval Ireland. But a whole laundry list of items. There's cauldrons, there's pots, there's items of gold, rings, bracelets, thumb rings, outfits in every print and color, from plain to plaid to striped. Their flocks of sheep, their herds of horses, cattle, pigs, even their prized ram, boar, and stallions. And in all of these, they were found to be equal except for one, which was her husband had a white bull, Finvanach, who, funnily enough, Maeve had gifted him not that long before. So she needs to go, so that she can maintain her equality and her independence, she wants to go acquire the brown bull of Cooley. And she starts off just asking, may I borrow him just for a year? I just want to stud him out so that I can have, my own prized bull. But unfortunately, her retinue that was with her, they're saying that they would steal it anyway. And so her request was denied, and she just ended up going with really the only opportunity that was left to her. And that was that she went to war. She marshaled all of the forces of Ireland, even though she was ostensibly maybe just the Queen of Connaught. She was able to get soldiers from every province. Even though things weren't going her way, she constantly was trying to find ways to, reach her end goal. And so she's promising her hand in marriage, she's promising wealth, she's promising territory, she's promising, the way that it's always translated, the pleasure of her own thighs, all sorts of different things, just whatever it's going to take to convince someone that to go try and fight Cuchulainn. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out for her, as we've discussed, but she at least is trying. And there's this interesting portion of the Táin where then all of the men of Ulster, they suddenly get over their curse, they're able to go off to fight, and this old man, Cethern, charges off in a chariot. And as he comes back, he's like holding his intestines in with his hand, and he's talking about how there's this tall, good-looking woman came at me. She had a fine, long face and a head of yellow hair. There were 2 gold birds on her shoulders, and she wore a dark purple hooded cloak. A keen-edged javelin blazed in one hand, and she held an iron sword aloft in her proud fist. She cut a striking figure. She was the first to wound me. And so I think it really just shows her power, politically, physically, monetarily. She was a really interesting individual. And one of the things that I love about Maeve is that you can really make a connection to so many different things within archaeology. So she's said to rule from the Mound of Rathcrowan, which is this monument here in the top right. I believe it's of Bronze Age date, but she's associated with so many different monuments in this area, including one called the Cave of the Cats, which was supposed to be an opening to the other world, and all the spirits would emerge on Samhain. There's actually an Ogham inscription saying Freyc, son of Mev. There's a little more that I would discuss there, but in the interest of time, just want to skip on then to the harp. And with the harp, of course, being probably the symbol that people associate with Ireland the most. And there are so many associations with it, and over the course of its long history, there have been more that have been added, it's changed. So it is kind of this complicated image, so I'm not going to do it necessarily quite justice, but I just want to say that I believe the first coins within Ireland to show a harp were issued by Henry VIII. And it was the crown on top of that, the harp. And it wasn't so much that Henry was then imposing this outside symbol or image into the Irish economy, but so much it was like a recognition of the importance of music, harps, poetry to the Irish social structure and Irish society. And so you see that even after independence, and even as Ireland goes and is adopting the euro, the harp is maintained. And this is because what were known as Fili. Fili, they were trained at special schools. They would know all the genealogies, all of the histories, and they would repeat them at feasts. And so it was a good way to build your renown, show that you can support the arts, but they also had kind of a dark side. And it was if you were not living up to your expectations, they would satirize you. And it was believed that, their words could be so strong, so powerful, so wicked, that so stinging that it could actually physically blemish you. And within this Irish context, the king was expected to be totally unblemished. If you lost an appendage, if you had some kind of weird thing going on your face, you were no longer fit to be ruler and would have to give up the throne in honor for somebody else. And so they wielded real kind of authority and power. Within those, there's not necessarily a particular deity that, as far as we can tell, is associated with the harp or with the Fili, but instead there are multiple deities who are able to play the harp, and there's certain strains: the strain of sleep, the strain of sorrow, the strain of joy. There's even some hints that maybe the Dagda, who's kind of like an Odin-like figure in Irish myth, was able to actually change the seasons by playing the music on his harp. The Salmon of Knowledge is another really interesting character, and in that, I think also numismatically, in that when the Irish Free State moved to issue their first coins, like I said, they really wanted to focus just kind of like animals, have this idea of, pastoral, agricultural, and even though there's so much myth associated with those different animals, it's only the salmon that that Yeats called out specifically, and suggested that the design submitted might include a sprig of hazel as reference to the Salmon of Knowledge. And there's all sorts of different tales associated with this and all sorts of different wells of knowledge located in different areas all around. Sometimes in this world, there's one located on the floor of the ocean, and supposedly it's kind of like the source of these 7 great rivers of Ireland. And in this, this well is ringed by 9 hazel trees, and the roots go deep down into the well. They absorb all of the knowledge in the waters, and they're all simultaneously budding, blooming, and fruiting these hazel trees. And as the hazels ripen, they fall into the well, and there's these salmon that are swimming around, and they eat the hazel, and they are able to then they become imbued with that knowledge. Probably one of the more famous stories associated with this is the hero Finn McCool. When he's a child, he goes and he finds the bard Finnegas fishing on the sides of the River Bowen, trying to catch the salmon of knowledge. He's been trying for years, and finally it happens. But he's exhausted. He wants to take a nap, and so he leaves it to Finn, to Finn to cook the fish, but tells him, like, don't touch it, don't eat anything. And over the course of him trying to cook it, he accidentally burns his thumb either on the fish or with oil, and he sticks it into his mouth, and suddenly he was able to access all of the knowledge of the world. And so whenever he ends up getting into a scrape in the future, he and his band of the Fianna, he just has to stick his thumb into his mouth, and he's able to find the answer out of their predicament. And it doesn't, the salmon of knowledge, I think it's really beautiful and it's interesting on the coins, but one of the images I like most is the gold medal for the Royal Irish Academy. The Royal Irish Academy, it was established in 1785. It's the island's premier scholastic society with membership considered to be the highest academic honor in Ireland. And each year they give out 2 gold medals to individuals in the fields of science, humanities, social sciences, and public service. It's taken by a woodblock print by J. Kaz Bentley. And given just the salmon's association with knowledge, it's not too surprising that it was chosen for the gold medal, but there may be another aspect at play here. And it could be this notion of the salmon potentially being the oldest being in the universe. And you see hints of it within Irish myths. There is one figure who, the name's escaping me, but there's a flood happens, I think potentially the biblical flood. He turns into a salmon to survive. The rest of the world essentially kind of wiped out. He transforms into different animals, but it's seen probably best in a Welsh tale called the Tale of Cúlach and Olwen, and they're trying to find the hunter Mabon, and essentially they go to the string of different animals, one each more ancient than the next, a blackbird, an owl, and they come to this eagle, and he talks about how when he was just like a young eagle, the rock that he stood on used to be a giant tall mountain, and he could peck at the stars in the sky. But now it was just barely a hand's breadth across. You could tell just how much it had eroded. But even he had no idea where this person was that they were searching for. But he knew someone who might. And it ended up being this giant salmon that they approach him, and he says, like, yes, actually, I had heard some crying at this prison a few nights back. Hop on my back. It's large enough for 2 of the heroes to stand abreast on him, and he carries them up to shore, and they essentially finish that leg of their quest. And so just given the age of the Royal Irish Academy, having gone all the way back to 1785, it could be that this is another play for association. They're not just the salmon of knowledge, but they're kind of that original source of knowledge and the perpetuation and continuation of that today.